at my daughter's birthday, Dad handed my sister's kids cash and ignored mine like they didn't exist. So I took my daughter and left that night. I cut off every dollar they lived on, and by morning, their cards were declined everywhere. My name is Mike. I'm 36 years old. And if you told me a few years ago that I'd be the one cutting my own parents off financially, I probably would have laughed and said you were being dramatic. Back then, family meant everything to me. I grew up thinking loyalty and blood went hand in hand, that no matter what disagreements we had, my parents would always treat me and my daughter fairly. I was wrong. What happened on my little girl's birthday wasn't just a slip, wasn't just a thoughtless moment. It was a dagger shoved straight into my chest right in front of everyone. My daughter, Emily, had just turned 7. She's the sweetest, kindest kid I've ever known. Yes, I'm her dad, so of course I'm biased, but everyone who meets her says the same. She's the type of kid who draws extra birthday cards for classmates who might feel left out, who saves the biggest slice of cake for someone else. She's thoughtful in a way most adults I know aren't. So when my parents showed up at her birthday party, I was genuinely hopeful. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe they'd see how incredible she is. The party itself was small. We rented out a little play cafe. Bright walls, balloons, simple decorations, a cake Emily had picked out herself with butterflies and pastel colors. She was bouncing with excitement wearing this sparkly purple dress she'd begged me to get. I wanted it to be her day, not some grand production, but something warm, special in hers. When my parents walked in with my brother and sister, trailing behind arms full of gift bags and shiny wrapping paper, I thought maybe, just maybe, they were finally going to put effort into treating her like they treated the other kids in the family. I watched as my dad pulled out envelopes, crisp, white, thick envelopes that I already knew weren't just holding cards. One by one, he handed them out to my sister's kids, to my brother's kids. Their eyes lit up as they tore them open, pulling out stacks of bills and glossy brand new iPads still in their shrink wrap. You could hear the cheers, the laughter, the ripping of packaging. My sister beamed, clapping her hands like her kids had just won the lottery. My brother leaned over to ruffle one of his son's hair, saying, "Now you'll really be the coolest kid in school." And then my dad turned to my daughter. He didn't pull out a bag. He didn't hand her an envelope. He just smirked, this cruel, dismissive twitch of a smile, and said, "She doesn't count as family." Time froze. I felt like every sound in the room had been sucked out, like all I could hear was my own heartbeat slamming in my chest. Emily's little smile faltered. She looked from her grandfather to me, confusion in her eyes, her hands twisting together because she didn't understand why she wasn't being given the same as the others. My mom looked away. Not a word of protest, not even a WS of shame, just turned her head as if ignoring it made it disappear. My sister's kids shouted with excitement as they powered up their new tablets. My brother's kids waved their cash in the air like it was a game, and my daughter. She just stood there, her sparkly purple dress suddenly feeling too bright, too loud in the silence pressing in around us. She whispered, "Dad, did I do something wrong?" That broke me completely. I felt anger rise in my throat, hot and bitter, but I didn't let it out. Not there, not in front of her. Instead, I knelt down, looked her right in the eyes, and told her the only truth I could manage without falling apart. "No, sweetheart, you're perfect. You did nothing wrong." I stood up, grabbed her little hand in mine, and without another word, I walked out of that party. Past the shocked faces, past my mother's lowered eyes, past my father's smug smirk that told me he thought he'd won whatever twisted game he was playing. My daughter's tiny fingers clutched mine as we stepped into the cool air outside. On the drive home, she sat quietly staring out the window, her cake untouched in the box on the seat between us. I kept replaying it in my head the way my dad had said it so casually, like she was less, like she didn't matter. And I realized something that hit me like a freight train. I had been funding their lifestyle for years. The house my parents lived in, I'd been paying their mortgage. The SUV my mom drove, at least in my name, their credit cards, I'd been covering those too because every time they came crying about hard times, I told myself I was helping family. But what kind of family treats your child like she's invisible? That night, as Emily slept curled up with her stuffed bunny, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting off my clenched jaw. I pulled up every account, every automatic payment, every lease agreement, and I started making calls. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't even shaking. I was calm, too calm, methodical. My parents had shown me exactly what my daughter meant to them. Now it was my turn to show them what they meant to me. And when the first text messages came in the next morning, panicked, confused, demanding to know why their cards weren't working at the grocery store, why the SUV wouldn't start, why the mortgage company had called, I didn't answer. I just poured myself a cup of coffee, sat back, and thought, maybe now they'll understand what it feels like to be told you don't count. But that was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop. At first, I thought it was just spam calls or work notifications piling up overnight, but when I rolled over and squinted at the screen, I saw my mother's name lighting up again and again. Missed call after missed call, dozens of texts stacked one after the other. Mike, something's wrong with the card. Did you change something with the SUV? It won't start. The bank says the mortgage hasn't cleared. What's going on? I stared at the messages for a long moment, my coffee brewing in the background, the rich smell filling my kitchen. It was surreal. Honestly, for years I'd been the safety net, the quiet fixer. Every time my parents overspent, every time my brother took out another loan he couldn't pay back, every time my sister forgot to make a bill payment, it was me they leaned on. I never questioned it too hard. They'd call it just a temporary help or just until things get better. Somehow it always became permanent. And now with one night of cutting the cord, their world had cracked. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I watched Emily pour cereal into her bowl, humming softly to herself, as if nothing had happened. She was too young to fully grasp the cruelty of yesterday, but I could see the shadow of it in the way she hesitated before asking, "Daddy, are Grandma and Grandpa mad at me?" My heart tightened. I reached across the table, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and said, "No, sweetheart. They're just figuring out some things. But listen to me. You didn't do anything wrong. You're the best part of this family. Never forget that." By the time I dropped her off at school, my phone was a war zone. My father had finally chimed in, his texts short and sharp. "Answer me, this isn't funny. You don't get to make decisions like this without consulting us. Consulting us." Like I hadn't been the one carrying them financially for years, like they were the ones in charge and I was some kid still living under their roof. I silenced the phone and went to work, but the silence didn't last. By noon, my brother called. Unlike my parents, he didn't bother with pleasantries. "What did you do?" He snapped as soon as I picked up. I could hear kids yelling in the background, probably his own children arguing over the new iPads. "I don't know what you mean," I said, sipping my coffee calmly. "Don't play dumb, Mike," he spat. "Mom's crying, Dad's furious, their cards are getting declined left and right. And the SUV. What did you do to it? Did you seriously cancel everything overnight?" I let a beat of silence pass. I didn't cancel anything that wasn't in my name. He cursed under his breath, then lowered his voice as if he didn't want his wife to hear. "You can't just pull the rug out like this. They depend on you. We depend on you. You know Dad's business dried up years ago. Without you, they're drowning." I leaned back in my chair. Funny. Yesterday, Dad didn't seem too concerned about who counts as family. Guess now he's realizing how much being part of the family really matters. There was silence on the other end. Then he barked, "Don't drag your kid into this. This is between you and them." I laughed, though it wasn't out of humor. "That's exactly the point." He dragged her into it. He made her feel like she didn't belong, like she wasn't family. And you all sat there and let it happen. So now you deal with the fallout. My brother tried to argue more, but I hung up before he could. That afternoon, my mom showed up at my house. I saw her through the window before she even knocked, standing on the porch, wringing her hands like she was the victim in all this. When I opened the door, she tried to brush past me into the living room, but I blocked her. "Mike," she said, her voice high and breathless. "You can't just do this. Your father is humiliated. We tried to get groceries this morning and the card declined at checkout. Do you know how embarrassing that was? Not nearly as embarrassing as telling a 7-year-old she doesn't count as family." I shot back. She flinched but didn't apologize. Instead, she pivoted. "He didn't mean it that way. You know how your father is. He speaks without thinking. He was just joking." "A joke," I repeated, my voice flat. "You really think that was a joke?" She pressed her lips together, then sighed dramatically. "Mike, you've always been so sensitive. We've always done what we could for you. Now that you're successful, it's your turn to support the family. That's how it works. Your father provided for you, and now you provide for us." That stung not because it was true, but because it was the story they'd been feeding me my whole life. My dad hadn't really provided. He'd scraped by cut corners and leaned on me the moment I started earning. But they built this narrative that I owed them, that every check I wrote and every payment I covered was some kind of debt repayment for being born. I stepped outside onto the porch, closing the door behind me so Emily wouldn't overhear. Mom listened carefully. "I'm not sensitive. I'm a father protecting my daughter. And if you think I'm going to let her grow up believing she's less than her cousins because of you, you're wrong. Yesterday was the line. Dad crossed it and you let him. I'm done." Her eyes welled up with tears, but they weren't the kind of tears that come from guilt. They were manipulative, the same kind she used when she wanted to tug at my sympathy. "Mike, if you cut us off, we'll lose everything. The house, the car. What will people think? Do you want that on your conscience?" I almost laughed again. Funny how you worry about what people think, but not what your granddaughter feels. That tells me everything I need to know. She sputtered, tried to say more, but I walked back inside and closed the door gently in her face. For the first time in years, I felt a strange calm settle over me. But the calm didn't last long. The family group chat exploded that evening. Messages flew back and forth. My sister demanding to know how I could ruin mom and dad's lives like this. My brother insisting I was overreacting. My dad finally joining in with a cold clipped line, "You've embarrassed this family enough. Fix what you broke. Fix what I broke." As if the brokenness wasn't there long before I cut off the money. And then came the kicker. My sister sent a photo into the group, her kids holding up their iPads smiling wide, captioned, "At least some of us appreciate what dad does for us. Too bad your daughter couldn't handle being left out for once." My hands tightened around the phone so hard I thought the screen would crack. Emily was sitting on the couch nearby, drawing quietly in her sketchbook, unaware of the digital war raging around her. I looked at her, my little girl, so innocent, so undeserving of the cruelty. And I knew this was far from over. They weren't just entitled, they were escalating. And if I thought walking away at the party was the end of it, I was wrong. This was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of tension and thinly veiled hostility. I had expected anger from my father, guilt-tripping from my mother, and constant pestering from my siblings. But what I didn't expect was how far they were willing to go to prove a point. By the end of that week, I realized this wasn't just about money. It was about control. About them reminding me that no matter how old I was, no matter what I built, I was still expected to play the role they assigned me. The provider, the fixer, the one who sacrificed while they indulged. At first, their retaliation was small but deliberate. My sister posted passive-aggressive photos on social media, her kids playing with their new iPads, all smiles with captions like, "Family is everything, read art." The irony so thick it nearly made me choke. My brother started parroting the same lines in the group chat, hinting that maybe I was unstable or losing touch because I dared to step back. They weren't directly confronting me anymore. They were trying to paint me as the problem, the black sheep. But the real turning point came the following weekend. Emily had a recital at her school. She'd been practicing for weeks. Every evening in her room, plucking away at her little violin with this determined frown that always melted into a proud grin. When she finally got a piece right, I promised her I'd be there front row cheering her on no matter what. For her, this was the event of the season. When we arrived, the school auditorium was buzzing with parents, siblings, and grandparents shuffling into the seats. Emily clutched her violin case like it was made of glass, bouncing nervously on her toes as we waited. I spotted my parents across the room sitting with my sister and brother's families. I hadn't expected them to show up. After everything, I thought maybe they'd stay away out of pride. But no, they were there, loud as ever, laughing, greeting other parents as if nothing had happened at all. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe they'd come to support Emily, that they'd finally realized what they'd done and wanted to make it right. But that naive hope didn't last long. When Emily's group took the stage, I watched her scan the crowd, her eyes searching for familiar faces. When she spotted me, her shoulders relaxed, and she gave a tiny wave. I waved back, my chest swelling with pride. But then her eyes drifted to the other side of the auditorium toward my parents, my sister, and my brother. That's when it happened. My dad leaned over to my sister, whispered something, and suddenly they all started laughing. Not the kind of laughter that bubbles up naturally, but sharp, deliberate, cruel. And as Emily lifted her bow to the strings, my father cupped his hands around his mouth and said loud enough for the nearby rows to hear, "Hope she doesn't squeak like last time." The words sliced through the silence of the auditorium like a knife. A few parents glanced around frowning, but my family just smirked, pretending it was harmless fun. My daughter froze. Her little hands trembled on the bow, and I could see the panic flooding her face. She squeaked not once, not twice, but the whole way through. Every note fractured, every rhythm fell apart. She tried to keep going, but tears welled up in her eyes, and by the end of the song, her chin was quivering. The applause came anyway. Parents always clapped for kids, but it was scattered, hesitant, because everyone had heard the remark. Everyone had seen the way my daughter crumbled under it. I wanted to storm across that auditorium, grab my father by the collar, and drag him out. But I didn't. Not then. I forced myself to stay seated because Emily needed to see me calm. She needed to know that I wasn't shaken, even if I was burning inside. After the recital, she walked off stage, her violin dangling limply at her side. She didn't run into my arms the way she usually did. Instead, she whispered, "Daddy, why did Grandpa say that? Why would he laugh at me?" I crouched down, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Because some people don't know how to be kind, sweetheart. But you were brave up there, and that's what matters." Behind us, I could hear my family gathering their things, laughing as if they hadn't just humiliated a child. My sister's voice carried above the crowd. Well, I guess she's not going to Juilliard anytime soon. More laughter. My mom didn't stop them. She didn't even look ashamed. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I had tolerated years of manipulation, years of being used like an ATM, years of being dismissed. But now it wasn't just me. They had come after Emily intentionally in public and broken something pure inside her. It wasn't favoritism anymore. It wasn't passive neglect. It was cruelty, deliberate, targeted cruelty. On the ride home, Emily sat silently in the back seat, her violin untouched beside her. Normally, she'd chatter all the way home, dissecting every detail of her performance, laughing about little mistakes, asking if I thought she did well. But that night, she just stared out the window, her reflection pale against the dark glass. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles whitened. My thoughts raced. Memories of every time they'd cut me down, every time they told me I owed them, every time they treated my daughter like she was less. And I realized with absolute clarity that I couldn't just cut them off financially. That was too easy for them to work around. No, I needed to take back something bigger, something they'd never expect. But before I even had the chance to formulate a plan, the betrayal deepened. The next morning, I found out my father had been talking to Emily's teacher. He had innocently pulled her aside after the recital and told her that Emily was sensitive and not really cut out for music. He suggested she be placed in less demanding activities. The teacher, bless her, called me directly and told me about it because she thought it was strange and inappropriate. She reassured me she wouldn't take his words seriously, but hearing it nearly made me sick. He wasn't just humiliating her publicly, he was trying to sabotage her privately. And when I confronted him about it, he didn't even deny it. He just shrugged over the phone and said, "Better she learns now than wastes everyone's time later." That was it. That was the breaking point. The emotional turning point I couldn't come back from. I looked at my daughter that night, curled up in bed, her violin case tucked under the covers like she was trying to protect it from the world. And I made a silent promise. Whatever it took, however long it took, they would never hurt her like this again. And when I was done, they would regret ever thinking she didn't count. After the recital and that phone call from Emily's teacher, something inside me shifted. Up until that point, I'd been angry, furious even. But I still held on to this thread of disbelief. I kept thinking maybe they'd come to their senses. Maybe they'd apologize. Maybe deep down they just didn't realize how much damage they were causing. But when I realized my father had gone out of his way to try and sabotage Emily's music, it was like a curtain dropped. That thin, fragile hope I had about reconciliation was gone. I didn't sleep much that week. Nights stretched into hours of staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying everything over and over. The look on Emily's face at her birthday party, the tears in her eyes on stage, the smug smirk my father wore while dismissing her as not family. Each memory cut deeper not because of what it meant for me, but because of what it was doing to my daughter. I started to notice changes in her too. She was quieter, less bubbly. Her violin sat untouched in its case for days. And when I gently asked if she wanted to practice, she shook her head and mumbled, "Maybe later." Later never came. It broke me to see her light dim like that. Emily had always been this vibrant, glowing presence in my life. Her laughter could fill a room. Her imagination could turn an empty living room into a castle. Now it was like someone had poured water over that flame, leaving only smoke. And I knew exactly who had struck the match. At work, I found myself staring blankly at my computer screen, my mind wandering. My coworkers probably thought I was just tired. But the truth was I was unraveling inside. I had spent years bending over backward to keep my family afloat, convincing myself it was what good sons did. And in return, they treated the one person who mattered most to me as disposable. It wasn't just cruel. It was a betrayal of everything family was supposed to mean. The text didn't stop either. My father would alternate between icy silence and harsh demands. "Restore the payments. Enough games. Then a day later, you'll regret this if you don't fix it." My mother leaned on guilt, sending long messages about how family isn't perfect and we all make mistakes and don't punish us over one little comment. She'd never mentioned the recital or the teacher or the deliberate cruelty. It was always framed like I was the one overreacting, like I was tearing the family apart. My sister and brother chimed in too. "You're embarrassing everyone. Don't make your daughter the center of your tantrums. Think about mom and dad's reputation." I didn't reply to any of them, not once. But their voices lingered, echoing in my head when the house grew quiet at night. I'd pace the kitchen, a glass of water in my hand I barely remembered pouring, and I'd wonder how I got here. How had I allowed myself to become so entangled, so obligated, that cutting them off felt like sawing off a limb? How had I spent years financing people who couldn't even muster the decency to clap for my daughter? It was in those long, restless nights that the grief hit hardest, because it was grief. Grieving the parents, I thought I had the family I thought existed. I realized I had been clinging to an illusion, some childhood belief that if I just gave enough, they'd love me enough in return. But they didn't. Not me, and certainly not Emily. The hardest moment came one evening when Emily padded into the living room, dragging her violin behind her like it was too heavy to carry. She plopped onto the couch next to me, resting her head against my arm. "Daddy," she whispered, "do you think I should stop playing?" My throat tightened. "Why would you say that?" She shrugged, her little shoulders rising and falling. Grandpa said, "I'm not good, and I don't want to mess up again." Ah! Everyone laughed. I pulled her into my arms, holding her so tight she squirmed. "Sweetheart, listen to me. You are good. You're better than good. You're brave. You went up on that stage and you played even when you were scared. That's what makes you amazing, not whether every note was perfect." She was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "But what if I'm not family enough?" That nearly shattered me. I pressed my forehead against hers and said, "You are my family. You're my whole world. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." When she fell asleep in my arms, I carried her to bed and sat by her side for a long time, watching her chest rise and fall. And that's when the planning began. Not in some dramatic flash of inspiration, but in small, deliberate thoughts that built slowly. I couldn't just cut them off and hope they'd fade away. They were too entitled, too stubborn. They'd claw their way back into our lives, always finding new ways to hurt her. No, I needed to make sure Emily and I were untouchable. That meant reevaluating everything: my finances, my will, my home. It meant drawing lines so deep in the sand they couldn't be crossed. I started quietly. I met with a lawyer under the pretense of updating some routine paperwork, but what I really wanted was to set protections in place. I asked about trusts, about guardianship, about how to make sure Emily's future was locked away where my family couldn't reach it. I didn't tell anyone, not even close friends, because I knew if word got out, my family would twist it into more ammunition. I also started pulling back socially. I stopped going to extended family dinners, stopped answering phone calls, stopped showing up at events I'd normally feel obligated to attend. The excuses were easy. Work's busy, Emily has school, we've got other plans. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. My sister posted online about how some people think they're too good for their own family, clearly aimed at me. My brother dropped hints in the group chat about me isolating Emily. My mom even sent a long, dramatic message to everyone talking about how I was turning my child against her grandparents. The irony was almost laughable. They had done that all by themselves, but isolation has a cost. As I pulled away, the loneliness crept in. Nights felt heavier, quieter. Even with Emily's laughter still filling the house, I felt the absence of something I used to think was permanent. It's a strange kind of pain mourning people who are still alive. Still beneath the grief, something steady was growing: resolve. I couldn't change who they were. I couldn't make them see Emily's worth, but I could make sure she grew up never doubting it herself. And I could make sure my family learned that actions have consequences. Once they couldn't buy their way out of with cash-stuffed envelopes or shiny new gadgets. By the time the month turned over, their calls had grown more desperate. My father even showed up at my office one afternoon, waiting outside the building like some storm cloud ready to burst. I slipped out the back before he could corner me. I wasn't ready yet. Not for the confrontation, not for the explosion I knew was coming, but deep down, I could feel it building. I was nearing a breaking point, and when it came, there'd be no going back. When you hit rock bottom, you either stay there and let the weight crush you, or you find something inside yourself you didn't know was there and start climbing. For a while, I didn't know which I'd be. I'd wake up, make Emily breakfast, take her to school, sit at my desk at work, and go through the motions like a man underwater, slow, heavy, muffled. But little by little, cracks of light started breaking through. The first shift came from Emily herself. One afternoon, I came home from work and found her in the living room with her violin out again. She wasn't playing anything serious, just plucking at strings, making silly noises, laughing at how squeaky it sounded. But it was the first time since the recital that she'd touched it. I leaned against the doorway, watching her experiment, her giggles filling the room, and I realized something. She was resilient, stronger than I'd given her credit for. They had tried to crush her, and while she bent under the weight, she hadn't broken. That lit something in me. I started leaning into my work again. For years, I'd built my career in finance, quietly not broadcasting it to my family because I didn't want to feed their entitlement. I owned a growing consulting firm. Steady clients, good contracts, nothing flashy. But now I doubled down. I began chasing bigger accounts, investing more time into hiring sharp people, expanding into areas I'd been too cautious to touch before. Every extra hour I poured into the business wasn't just about me. It was about Emily's future, about building something so solid and untouchable that no one, not even my parents, could claim a piece of it. And success came quickly once I shifted gears. The firm landed a massive deal with a tech company that had been circling us for months. That one contract alone doubled our revenue for the quarter. I reinvested immediately, opening a new office in a neighboring city. For the first time in a long while, I felt momentum pulling me forward instead of dragging me down. With that momentum came power. Financial power, yes, but also emotional. The more I grew, the less my family's absence felt like a wound, and the more it felt like freedom. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their validation. I was proving to myself day after day that I could thrive without them. It wasn't just about work, though. I threw myself into Emily's world, too. If my family wasn't going to celebrate her, I would. I signed her up for art classes, painting clay, anything that let her creativity out. I took her to a music shop and let her pick out new strings for her violin, telling her it was an upgrade for a real musician. Slowly, her spark started coming back. She'd run up to me after class, proudly showing me messy paintings of butterflies or lopsided clay animals, her face glowing. One night, I found her asleep at her desk with sheet music under her cheek. It was a simple lullaby she was trying to master. I tucked her into bed and sat staring at that music for a long time. That tiny piece of paper with crooked notes penciled in by her small hand meant more than any check I'd ever written for my parents. Meanwhile, my family's decline was visible from a distance. My brother had to sell his car after failing to make payments. My sister posted cryptic rants online about fake people who abandoned their families. My parents' house, once meticulously maintained, started showing signs of neglect, the lawn overgrown, the shutters peeling. Word trickled back to me through mutual acquaintances. They were struggling, and yet they still tried to spin the story. In the group chat, they claimed I was the selfish one, that I was flaunting my success while letting them rot. My father even sent a message one night saying, "You wouldn't have anything if not for me. Remember who raised you?" I didn't reply. Instead, I focused on something that would make them irrelevant. I met again with my lawyer, expanding the plans I'd begun during my lowest point. We structured a trust for Emily that secured every dollar I earned for her future. We built clauses that locked out any claim from relatives. My lawyer even chuckled at how ironclad I wanted it. "Mike," he said, "you're essentially building a fortress around her inheritance. They won't be able to touch a cent." That's the point, I told him. At the same time, I began making subtle moves at work that gave me influence in circles my family couldn't even dream of reaching. Networking dinners, charity events, local sponsorships. I was shaking hands with CEOs, donors, people who carried weight in the community. And with every connection I built, my parents' relevance shrank further. I wasn't just distancing myself, I was outgrowing them entirely. But here's the thing about growth. It doesn't erase the scars. As much as life was improving, the hurt lingered. There were nights I'd pour a drink and sit in silence, thinking about how it could have been different. If my father had just clapped at that recital, if my mother had just said, "She's family." If my siblings had just once stood up for Emily, maybe things wouldn't have gotten this far. But they didn't. And every success I stacked up only reminded me of what they'd thrown away. Emily, though, she noticed the change. She'd crawl into my lap sometimes and say, "Daddy, you smile more now." That broke me in a different way. Because she was right. I was smiling more. Not because the pain was gone, but because I finally felt like I was steering our lives instead of being yanked around by guilt. One Saturday, I took her to the park, and while she ran ahead chasing bubbles with other kids, I sat on a bench and let the sun warm my face. For the first time in months, I felt light. I realized that no matter what storm my family tried to throw at me, I was stronger now. Emily was stronger, and together we were building something better than the mess I came from. Of course, peace never lasts long. My family wasn't done. They couldn't accept that I was rising while they sank. The more they struggled, the more desperate they became. And desperate people make reckless choices. I didn't know it yet, but the real battle was only beginning. By the time spring rolled around, I had settled into a rhythm. Work was booming. Emily was laughing again, and I had built a kind of invisible wall between us and the rest of my family. They were still trying, of course, still texting, still leaving voicemails, still posting their not-so-subtle digs on social media, but they were no longer getting through, at least not directly. But while I had finally pulled myself and Emily into a place of stability, I couldn't shake the gnawing thought that this wasn't over. My parents weren't the type to slink away quietly. They thrived on control, on appearances, and on other people's money. Without me funding their lives, they were cornered animals, and cornered animals lash out. It was during this uneasy calm that something unexpected fell into my lap. One afternoon, my business partner forwarded me an email from a regional bank we sometimes dealt with. It was routine, just some financial statements, but attached at the bottom, I noticed a familiar name. My father. Apparently, he'd been applying for a line of credit and had listed me as a guarantor. Without my consent, I stared at the document in disbelief. It had my name, my address, even my business listed. He had forged my information. My blood ran cold as I scrolled through the details. Not only had he tried to leverage my financial credibility, but he'd also grossly exaggerated his own assets, claiming ownership of things I knew for a fact he didn't have anymore. For years, I quietly bailed them out of messes like this. I'd write the check, smooth it over, and let them off the hook. But this time I wasn't bailing them out. This time I saved the email, forwarded it to my lawyer, and began a different kind of planning. When I met with my lawyer later that week, he whistled low as he read through the file. "Mike, this isn't just desperate. This is fraud. If the bank pushes, your father could be in very real legal trouble." I leaned back in my chair. "Good." He looked at me over his glasses, eyebrows raised. "You're not planning to bail him out?" "No," I said firmly. "Not this time. Not ever again." We sat in silence for a moment before he asked, "Do you want to pursue this?" I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to throw the whole thing back in my father's face to show him the proof and watch him squirm. But another part of me wanted patience. I had leverage now, and leverage is worth more when you let it ripen. That was the seed of my plan. Over the next few weeks, I started pulling threads quietly, carefully. I spoke with contacts in the business community, the same ones I'd been shaking hands with at dinners and charity events. It turned out my father's name had come up before. He had a reputation in certain circles. Someone who once had money but was notorious for bad debts and borrowing connections. The more I listened, the clearer the picture became. He wasn't just struggling financially, he was on the brink of losing everything. And my mother. I learned she'd been bragging in her book club for years about how generous her son was, painting the picture of me as their lifelong safety net. Some of the women in that group had quietly reached out to me. One even apologized, saying, "We always thought you didn't mind the way she told it." That infuriated me, but it also gave me more fuel. I wasn't going to let their narrative stand unchallenged forever. Then there was my brother. He had gotten into real estate investments a few years back, riding the market while it was hot. Now with the downturn, he was drowning in debt. Rumor had it he was behind on multiple mortgages. My sister wasn't any better. She'd try to start some boutique mom business selling overpriced candles and home decor, but it had flopped spectacularly. She was living off credit cards and her husband's paycheck. One by one, the pillars of their entitlement were crumbling. And here I was in the strongest position of my life. At home, I started preparing Emily too. Not in a direct way, but in little lessons. I'd teach her about saving, about the difference between needs and wants, about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who lift you up instead of drag you down. I never mentioned her grandparents directly, but I saw the way her eyes sharpened when she listened. She understood more than I gave her credit for. The turning point came when I was invited to a local gala. It was a charity fundraiser for children's arts programs, fitting given Emily's love for music. I decided to attend, partly to show support, partly to continue building connections. That night, as I stood in the ballroom surrounded by business leaders, I realized just how far I'd come. I wasn't the quiet son in the shadow of his parents anymore. I was a man who could stand on his own command, respect, and build a future without anyone's permission. And then fate handed me another weapon. At the gala, I bumped into an old acquaintance who happened to work in municipal planning. We chatted casually, and he mentioned almost in passing that there was a new development project being reviewed, one that just so happened to border the neighborhood where my parents lived. He joked about how property taxes there were about to skyrocket if the project went through. That nugget stuck with me. My parents were already struggling to pay their bills. If taxes rose significantly, they'd be in even deeper trouble. And I had the resources to not only weather it, but to benefit from it. If I positioned myself right, I could end up owning property in that very area, maybe even theirs, without lifting a finger to take it. The market would do it for me. For weeks, I played it cool. I gathered documents, kept the fraudulent bank application tucked away, built my contacts, and expanded the trust I'd set up for Emily. Every move I made was quiet, deliberate, surgical. My family had no idea how far ahead I was setting the chessboard. They still thought they could bully me back into submission with guilt and insults. They had no clue I was about to turn the board upside down. It was around this time that my mother tried a new tactic. She showed up at Emily's school unannounced. I got a call from the front office telling me that Grandma had stopped by with cookies for the kids. When I arrived, my mom was in the lobby, beaming like nothing had ever happened. Emily, on the other hand, stood stiffly beside her, looking uncomfortable. "Mike," my mom said brightly, as if we were in the middle of some happy reunion. I thought I'd surprise Emmy. I took Emily's hand and looked my mother dead in the eye. "Don't ever come here unannounced again." Her smile faltered. "Oh, don't be dramatic. I'm her grandmother. I have every right to see her." "No," I said flatly. You don't. Not anymore. The silence that followed was thick. Emily squeezed my hand, and for the first time I saw her look at her grandmother not with confusion or longing, but with a kind of quiet resolve. That was the moment I knew I wasn't just protecting her anymore. I was teaching her how to protect herself. And while my family thought they were still playing the same old game, I was already 3 moves ahead. Because soon, very soon, I was going to use everything I'd learned, the forged documents, the financial instability, the community connections, and even the rising property taxes to make sure they understood exactly what it meant when I said Emily. And I didn't count on them anymore. They always said things have a way of coming back around. They just never meant it would hit them for me. I'd spent months laying the groundwork, legal locks around Emily's future, quiet conversations with people who owed me favors, learning the slow language of municipal politics and collecting proof. The forged bank document was the first domino. Once I handed that file to my lawyer, the bank's fraud department did what banks do when you hand them a smoking gun. They opened a formal investigation, froze the questionable applications, and started asking very uncomfortable questions. My father called me a coward for not fixing it, like I owed him the privilege of bailing him out of his own lies. I didn't answer, but legal trouble is only half the equation. The other half was leverage. I had cultivated that peace by patient peace. There were the property rumors I'd quietly confirmed at the gala, the development that would upend the neighborhood, the tax reassessments that were likely to follow. There were the names of the contractors and the purchasing agents who would move first. There was the quiet account of my brother's failed investments. His mortgages were fragile enough that one sudden tax spike would make them collapse like a house of cards. I didn't start the market forces. No, I simply positioned myself so that when the market moved, I could steer the consequences in ways that exposed more than just balances and ledgers. Early on a Tuesday, the dominoes started to fall. It began small and ordinary. My sister's social feed lit up with the usual smiling family photos. Only this time, one of the photos had an unexpected caption. A mutual friend from the school committee, someone who'd heard the story from the fundraiser circuit, reposted an old picture of my parents with the line, "Funny how some families demand gratitude while treating others like dirt." The comment thread filled with questions. People I'd met at work, neighbors, even a few of the women from my mother's book club who'd privately sent me apologies. Suddenly, they were public. My sister reacted the way entitled people do, defensively, with outrage and conspiracy theories. But outrage doesn't explain away screenshots or bank records when they're laid out in order. Then came the bank. They called my father in for questioning about the guarantee. Their inquiries weren't secret. The bank's legal team made sure there was a paper trail. For the first time since I'd been paying the mortgage and the SUV lease, he had to sit across from strangers and explain why I was listed as a guarantor on loans he had no right to attach my name to. He fumbled. He lied. When the bank threatened to refer the case to the district attorney, his voice went small. There are few things more humiliating to someone who built a life around machismo than realizing it's not bluster that protects you. It's paper and signatures and truth. At the same time, my brother's lender called him in about an accelerating default. A tax reassessment followed by a home insurance reevaluation had pushed his payments into arrears. My brother's pride had kept him from asking me for help. He'd always loved the drama of outspending his means, but pride can't pay a mortgage when the math changes overnight. He sold the nicer of his cars in a panic and started floating messages about tough times on social media. The kind of thinly veiled pleas that used to come straight to my phone with begging eyes and just until next month. Not this time. And then the most delicious little stroke of all, the SUV. I had canceled the lease months ago and put the car back into a holding account that the leasing company could take whatever action they needed on. I'd ensured every return notice was legally spotless. No grounds for complaint. Late one afternoon, I got a forwarded text from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. A photo of the SUV being towed away from the grocery store parking lot. My mother's face red and furious in the reflection of the rear window. The tow operator looking bored and professional. The caption read, "When you spin like it's 2010 but live like it's 1995. The image traveled faster than any family group chat argument ever had. I didn't dance on graves. I'm not some cartoon villain. But there was a small, private warmth to watching the consequences of their choices land where they belonged. For years, they had weaponized shame against me, used the idea of what people will think to keep me paying, to keep me quiet, to keep my daughter in her place. Now the public questions and the very visible unpaid balances were the things keeping them up at night. I'd move them out from behind their closed doors and into the light where their behavior couldn't be smoothed over by excuse or manipulation. Still, I kept my moves surgical. When the bank's investigator called to ask if I wanted to file a criminal complaint for identity fraud, my lawyer and I discussed it like two chess players analyzing lines. It would take months, possibly longer, and it would shred their credit in a way that could cascade into forced sales and bankruptcies. It would humiliate them in court. It would also inevitably drag Emily into public family turmoil. I thought about that, and then I thought about the recital, the birthday party, the way my father had smiled as if he were the one in the right and made the decision. We filed. That evening, the district attorney's office sent a letter acknowledging receipt of the complaint and requesting cooperation in their preliminary inquiry. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope, but the effect it had on our life was anything but plain. My mother called me in a panic voice, high and accusing. "This is a witch hunt," she said. "You're going to ruin us." My brother texted me a string of capital letters and exclamation points. My sister resorted to passive-aggressive posts about how families should stick together. Each response only tightened my resolve. I'd expected a backlash. I'd anticipated the family chant of "How could you?" The attempts to shame me into rolling everything back, but I hadn't expected the community to tilt. The PDA emails started to include awkward silence when my mother tried to book the bake sale table. Invitations stopped arriving. People in our neighborhood, the same ones who used to chuckle and nod at their generosity, began to edge away. That hurt them more than being denied cash. They were social animals, and social standing was their oxygen. While the legal process unfolded, I executed another layer of the plan. I used my LLC to buy a small parcel of property 2 streets over from my parents' house. A vacant lot that the development I'd heard about would soon make valuable. I didn't buy it to gloat. I bought it because in a few months, when rezoning and taxes took their course, I wanted to be in a position to make a fair market offer that the bank or an auctioneer would accept. In the worst-case scenario, I could be the purchaser at a trustee sale. Owning the lot would be a move in the same game they tried to play with me. Only I was playing by the rules and brilliantly. There were procedural satisfactions along the way. Formal letters from lawyers to phone calls from people I'd once done favors for, politely declining further contact, the quiet snubbing of my parents at community events. But the thing that put the most salt in the wound wasn't the legal paperwork or the auctions or the repossessions. It was the shift in the way Emily held herself. She watched as this house of cards shook and fell around them. And instead of crumbling again like she had at the recital, she stood straighter. She asked me questions, fewer about revenge, more about fairness and strength. "Why do people treat some kids differently?" she'd ask over cereal. "Because sometimes people are small inside," I'd tell her. "And when they're small, they try to make others feel small too. But you're not small, Em. You never were." She'd smile, and the light in her eyes came back in flashes that warmed something in me that had been raw for a long time. Then the final piece fell into place, the one I'd been building toward without telling anyone. The bank, unsettled by the fraud and nervous about potential liability, chose to foreclose on the smallest of the outstanding properties tied to my father's name. It wasn't the house he'd always boasted about. It was a rental he'd used as collateral on a line of credit. The auction notice went out, publicly posted in the legal section of the paper, and my legal team confirmed the date. I could have let it go to auction and stood back watching them scramble. I could have let the market take them and quietly purchased the property later. But there's an art to vengeance. Timing, theater precision, and the thought of simply being the anonymous buyer felt anticlimactic. What I wanted was for them to understand finally and fully the cost of their choices. I wanted a moment where they looked up from the rubble of their lives and saw me standing there, calm, composed, and unbothered. I wanted the look on my father's face when he realized his prying hands had been swapped for a closed door. So I arranged a small thing. I told my lawyer I wanted to be present at the auction under an assumed company name. I had the cashier's check ready. I had the LLC paperwork prepared to transfer the deed. I told Emily only that we were going to see how auctions work. No fanfare, no talk of revenge, only a quiet lesson in markets and consequences. On the morning of the sale, I woke earlier than usual. The air had that clean electric quality of a day when something irreversible is about to happen. I tucked Emily's hand into mine and drove past our old neighborhood toward the municipal building where trustee sales were held. People milled around, mostly strangers, some curious neighbors. My parents weren't there yet. They'd been scrambling, calling every relative they could in hopes someone would bail them out at the last minute. Pride can make you slow to act, and shame can make you slow to ask. I checked my phone. A message from my sister. "Where are you?" A string of frantic posts from my mother. Begging promises to change had started sprinkling across social media. The kind of desperate performance they thought would sway me. It wouldn't. I felt a small private compassion for them. They were panicking in the only language they knew. Inside the room, bids began. The auctioneer called the numbers in that sing-on cadence that makes property feel like a commodity rather than a home. I held the bid card with an odd detachment, like someone watching a stage performance from the back row. The prices climbed. People shuffled pieces of paper. My heart beat steady. When the property was finally within reach, I raised my card just once. The gavel came down. The murmurs in the room shifted. I signed the paperwork. We transferred funds. It took mere minutes, dry and administrative, to make the purchase legally binding. But I knew what the ripple would look like. Statements to the credit bureaus. Liens recorded the bank's exposure, finally visible on paper. I had done this with surgical calm. Then came the call I've been waiting for. My father's voice on the line was thin and cracked. "Mike," he said as if addressing a stranger, "please, we can fix this." "We can't." He couldn't finish. I listened, the corner of my mouth lifting in a way that felt unfamiliar and righteous. "I already fixed it," I said softly. "I bought the property today." I heard silence on the other end and then the sputter of disbelief. "You can avoid a lot of pain if you leave Emily out of your life. Walk away. Let us be." The thermostat of my conscience clicked. The words were blunt, but they were the truth. He begged. I stayed calm. I offered one last quiet olive branch. If they participated in family counseling and made a public apology acknowledging what they'd done, I would consider unwinding some of the more public actions with counsel. It was a conditional apology. Yes, protection always is, but it was real leverage tied to real consequences. He said no. So, I let the motion continue. As we drove back, Emily chattered about how auctions were kind of like a game, and I told her that sometimes people play hard and unfair, and sometimes you have to be willing to play better. The sun was bright, the car hummed, and a small unbidden thought crossed my mind. This was working. The plan was unfolding the way I had constructed it in the quiet hours. The legal complaints, the targeted purchases. The strategy of letting the market do half the work, while my actions did the other half. We pulled into the driveway and my phone buzzed. It was my sister. It was a short message. "You're going to regret this." I read it, then looked down at Emily, who had fallen asleep against the window. Violin case snug beside her like a sleeping animal. I was about to press send on a final email to my lawyer, one that would initiate the next phase, the public notice and the transfer of title, when my hand hesitated. There was another call buzzing. My father again, and beyond him, the slow, cooling voice of our town gossiping in the background on social media. I thought of the recital of the birthday party, of my daughter's small, confused face, asking why she wasn't enough. I opened the draft email, read the last clause I'd written, one that spelled out the terms of their last chance, and then stopped. I realized I was moments away from pulling a trigger that would change everything, not just their lives, but our lives, in a way that might be irreversible. I set the phone down. The sun fell across Emily's face. I thought of forgiveness, of silence, of the kind of person I wanted to be when all of it was done. Then I thought of my daughter's violin under the blanket, of the way she'd found the courage to pick it up again, and I tightened my jaw. I had sent on the email. The rest had to be handled in person. I booked a time to meet with them at the community center under the pretense of wanting to talk things through. I told no one the truth about what I bought that morning. I wanted their reactions to be genuine, not manufactured by knowledge. When the three of them walked into the fluorescent lit room that afternoon, my mother clutching a tissue box like it was proof of performance, my father looking oddly smaller, my sister glaring like someone used to being obeyed, I felt the weight of the moment settle like a held breath. I stood, and for the first time in years, I looked at them as if they were strangers. "Before we start," I said, reaching into my bag, "there's something you need to know." And then I showed them the deed. The look on their faces when I laid the deed on the table was worth more than every dollar I'd spent, more than every sleepless night, more than every bitter text I'd ignored. My father's jaw went slack. My mother's tissue froze halfway to her cheek, and my sister actually laughed at first until she saw the seal on the document. "You're lying," my father said finally, his voice low and shaky, like an old dog trying to bare its teeth one last time. I slid the paper toward them. "It's public record. You can look it up yourself." My sister snatched it, eyes darting back and forth across the lines. Her face drained. "No, this can't be right. You wouldn't do this to us." "I didn't do this to you," I said evenly. "You did it to yourselves. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences." My mother let out this wailing sound, half anger, half grief. "We're your family, Mike. How could you humiliate us like this after everything we've done for you?" I laughed, then quietly shaking my head. "Everything you've done for me, like telling my daughter she doesn't count as family, like laughing while she cried on stage, like sabotaging her with her teacher. If that's what family is, I'd rather have none." My father tried to rally, pounding the table. "You owe us respect," he barked. I met his glare and didn't flinch. Respect isn't owed, it's earned. And you lost mine the second you decided my child was disposable. The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time in my life, they had nothing to throw back. No threats, no guilt trips, no manipulative speeches, just the crushing weight of their own ruin. My sister snapped first, slamming her hands on the table. You'll regret this. When people find out what you did, they already know. I cut in. You've made sure of that with your own behavior. People aren't blind. They've seen the way you treat Emily, the way you twist every story. The only thing I've done is stop covering for you. Her face twisted, but no words came out. I stood then, slipping the deed back into my folder. Here's how this goes. You stay away from me. You stay away from my daughter. If you can't manage that, the next papers you'll see won't be property deeds. They'll be subpoenas. Consider this your last warning. My father's eyes, once full of fire, now looked small. Beaten. He muttered something under his breath, but I didn't care to hear it. I turned to leave. Emily's future tucked safely under my arm. As I walked out of that room, my mother called after me, her voice breaking. You'll regret turning your back on us. I stopped in the doorway, looked back once, and said the only truth that mattered. No, I regret not doing it sooner, and then I left them there in the stale light of that community center with nothing but the echo of their own failure. In the weeks that followed, the fallout spread like cracks through glass. The bank pressed charges, their reputation collapsed, and the community that once excused their arrogance turned cold. My brother sold off what little he had left. My sister's business dissolved, and my parents' house, over-leveraged and drowning under back taxes, eventually went up for sale. I didn't buy it. I didn't need to. They had already lost the only thing that mattered: control. Meanwhile, Emily thrived. She picked up her violin again, slowly at first, then with the same joy she once had. At her next recital, she played with confidence, her bow steady, her chin lifted. When the applause came, she looked out into the audience and found me smiling back at her. Not my parents, not my siblings, just me, and that was enough. Afterwards, she ran into my arms, breathless and beaming. Did you hear, Daddy? I didn't squeak this time. I hugged her tight, the sound of her laughter filling every empty place my family had left behind. I heard, Sweetheart, you were perfect. And in that moment, I realized something. Revenge hadn't just been about tearing them down. It had been about building us up, me and her together, free from their shadows. They had tried to make her feel like she didn't count. Now the world was proving otherwise. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she whispered, Daddy, we don't need them, do we? I kissed her forehead. No, Emily, we never did. And with that, the chapter closed, not with shouting or chaos, but with quiet triumph. They had lost everything they thought made them powerful, and we had gained everything they could never touch. The final line, the one that stayed with me, wasn't something I said out loud. It was something I felt deep in my chest as I watched my daughter drift to sleep, safe and loved. In the end, they were right about one thing. Family is everything. They just never realized mine started and ended with